Welcome to the Cota Capital Podcast. My name is Simone Brunozzi. I'm your host. And today joining me is Sam Heidari. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Simone. Good
Thanks
to see
for,
you again.
yeah, of course. Thanks for being with us. So I think the audience will be very interested in hearing from you. Sam is not only a technologist, an engineer, but he also had several experiences as entrepreneur and or as a member of startups. In fact, you worked for startups most of your life. But for the purpose of this particular podcast, we're going to focus on your latest experience with Quantenna, which you spell Q-U antenna, Quantenna. And so tell us a bit about what the company is, even though you're no longer as involved as you were before. And tell us a bit about the story in which you got involved, you joined the company, then you became CEO. Tell us all about it.
Right. The company, our tagline at company was to make Wi-Fi perfect. We said, well, Quantenna is Wi-Fi perfected. And the idea was that early on when the company started, we had this vision that Wi-Fi is going to become a very important interface in the industry or in use worldwide. And there's new applications, and the use of it is going to require a great non-incremental but a big leapfrog type of improvement to the performance. So Quantenna was in the business of making the highest performance Wi-Fi in the world, and the highest performance was measured in many different ways. Obviously, through gigabits per second is one metric, but as well as reliability and the range as well in the world to make Wi-Fi networks just looking like wireline networks.
And
so that was
and sorry to interrupt you. So Quantenna was producing a chipset that
That's
other
right.
companies could embed into their Wi-Fi routers, for example, and then provide a better performance compared to other chipsets that were on the market at that point.
Absolutely. Quantenna was a fabless semiconductor company which was making chipsets for Wi-Fi, and we were selling to what was in the infrastructure of the Wi-Fi, not into
Nice.
the end devices and the clients. Yes.
Nice. So you joined the company as head of engineering or VP of engineering, and
Correct.
this was 2009, if I recall
That's
correctly.
correct.
But
That's
then
correct.
shortly thereafter, they essentially gave you the role of a temporary or interim CEO. And then a few months later, they actually told you, you know what, you can stay as CEO, just keep going. So tell us a
That's
bit about how that happened and how actually you managed to transition from a technical role to a managerial role, even though you were still involved in some technical aspects of it.
That's right. So the company was going through some turmoil. They were looking for a new CEO. I would say that coming from a technical background actually was a benefit at that stage of the company because most of the things were around the product development. As a matter of fact, the partners at Sequoia said they love to have their at the time that I was getting selected, they said they would love to have their CEOs of more of a technical background. And if you look at the companies in our space, such as Broadcom, Qualcomm, Marvell, they were all founded by PhDs who were extremely technical. As a matter of fact, many of them were professors in universities. So, having a good understanding of the technology was actually a benefit. But in addition, I think that what you need is not only to understand the solution, but to also bring up your head and understand the problem. So the market, what is the need? And that makes a complete package. And for a technologist to become a CEO, actually, that it is easier for you to learn if you want, and you have the ambition to learn the market and the solution and so forth, than it is the other way around for a guy who's coming from the other side trying to understand the core technology.
Yeah.
And in this stage of the company, that actually it played well that I being able to understand the technology.
So what I like a lot about Quantenna and your story is that, as you know, here in Silicon Valley, we both live in the Valley. I live in San Francisco. You live in Silicon Valley proper. We hear a lot of stories about unicorns, about IPOs, about companies. And some of the companies like Quantenna that are actually very successful are not really famous in the sense of being the hottest startup that people talk about, simply because when you use the product, you don't even know you're using Quantenna because you're using a Wi-Fi router. You have no idea who built the chipset. But the interesting part about your company, or I mean the company you were involved with, was that when you joined, or let's say shortly thereafter when you became CEO, the company, this is ballpark 2010, so 10 years ago, your company was making about $1 million in revenue, or in that range. 2016, you go IPO, and 2019, you get acquired. And by 2016, your revenues are already at $120 million. Right. And 2019, yeah, I mean, yes, we rehearsed, so that helped. And 2019, you get to $220 million in revenues, 220, not 2.2, 220. So you grew essentially more than 100x in revenues in just 6 years to the time of IPO. So what do you think were the factors that helped you, in addition to your execution, of course, but what were the the tailwinds that helped your company grow that fast in a relatively difficult market to be?
Right. So I think that there is a couple different things that I can think of right now. One is that the size of the market was big. So we entered a market that had a very, very big size. As a matter of fact, the opposite of that, my story of the previous startup that I was involved with, we got to 80% market share with $150 million revenue. So it was hard to grow after that, right? Because the market was small. In this case, the Wi-Fi market is a multi-billion-dollar market, which is growing. So taking a piece of that and being specialized on that is actually makes a big difference. The second thing is for any kind of a smaller company to come into play, you have to have something which is an order of magnitude better than others. You cannot be incrementally better because nobody is going to get fired for choosing the same vendor as the previous one who has a history with the company and is a brand name recognized. But people, if they make the wrong choice on you, they will lose their jobs because like, why did you take that company that no one heard of? So it has to value proposition has to be so much different that people can make that the hard decisions easy.
Yeah. So let me try to look at some of the important points here. One, you already did startups. You already were familiar with $100+ million in revenues in your previous startups. And you joined as a VP of engineering, then you made CEO. So I assume, and I think I'm not mistaken, that on the execution side, you were doing the right things, even though everybody does mistakes. But let's say you were doing very well on that front. But you also had a large market that at that time incumbents were not completely aware of. So the large companies, the equivalent of an IBM in the 80s when Microsoft came in, were not really looking at the home PC back then, right? So in 2010, large companies were not looking at Wi-Fi because Wi-Fi, it's hard for us to imagine this because now in 2020, Wi-Fi is so ubiquitous. We use it all the time. We associate, as you like to joke about, we say Wi-Fi when we mean internet. We use the Wi-Fi. We connect to the Wi-Fi when we actually mean we use Wi-Fi to eventually connect to the internet. But back in 2010, the big guys were not really interested or were not investing a lot in this. So you had a large market.
In the market segment that we focus, but yes. In within the Wi-Fi. But go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the market was large enough at least for you to grow. You had a product that was significantly superior to what the other companies were doing. So you had some of the most important elements for a successful company. The fourth element, though, which I'm going to ask you in a moment, I know it's going to be painful, it's related to fundraising because we're talking about 2010. You are a hardware startup in a way, and you have to deal with telcos, internet service providers. Was it easy for you to raise money? I assume you did raise money multiple times during your career as CEO there. How was it?
Yeah, so you said it wasn't easy very lightly. It was extremely difficult. So I used to say that when you walked in Sand Hill Road and you tell the people that you are in the semiconductor business at the time, they show you the door. And if you say you're in the service provider portion of the semiconductor, they says, oh, we forgot to kick you while you're walking out the door. So it was very difficult. And, but the point is the conviction that you have and the fact that you believe that you're going to make something here and the sense of responsibility and the care factor, is the energy that you get to turn every stone till you get there. So my advice to all the entrepreneurs is, if you do believe in it, and you have to, the first step for you is, before you do anything, you have to sit down and convince yourself and fall in love with the problem and the solution. If you do believe in it, then then you can do it. So I had to turn a lot of stones and travel around the world multiple times. I could spend probably a full podcast about my stories of traveling in the corners of the world to raise money, till to a point that it had a rippling effect. The first guy who signed up, I had the army of the people who wanted to sign up too. But getting the first lead was the most difficult one to do. And once we did that, actually ended up to be a very meaningful fundraising. We raised $60 million, which was one of the largest ones for a semiconductor company at the time. I mean, some IPOs were smaller than that at the time. And at the same time, we were oversubscribed, and we had the option of another $20 million along the way if you wanted to choose. So things turn around after a very hard process and a lot of conversations with the people around the world.
Nice. And I guess timing is also particularly important here, because when you joined this company, essentially 2009, 2010, this was just after the big depression in 2008, 2009. Yep. So right. The markets were still recovering, and the funding, especially in Silicon Valley, was not exactly at its highest or at its peak. So it was very difficult. But then at the same time, you had the iPhone in 2007. You had Wi-Fi exploding in those years. So essentially, the timing was pretty much perfect, because you had a great product and you managed, thankfully and successfully, to raise money to propel the company to, essentially more than $100 million in revenues by the time you hit the IPO. But then, 2019, the company got acquired. And it's interesting that now in 2020, the same approach, the same market, the same product differentiation would probably not be as compelling as it was for you, for that company, at least a few years ago. So timing was also on your side, in a sense.
Of course, you can never be too early or too late to a market, right? So that's actually the part that the luck involves a lot. You could have the best vision in the world, and you could miss the window opportunity, window of the opportunity. Yeah. So it is, that the timing was right, and I think that we made a bet. We were convinced of that bet. We aligned the company to that bet. There was plenty of this. I mean, the Wi-Fi market was big and growing, but everyone was focused on the client side. So what was happening with the big guys who said, okay, I can sell it to every PC and laptop, and the mobile phones are coming along, I can sell it to every one of those. But now I don't want to spend any time on the or money on the infrastructure. I'll just use the same chipsets to sell it over there, because it's going to cost me as much money, and I don't want to do that. Why, when I can sell the same thing there? We saw that opportunity. I said, let's optimize this thing, Wi-Fi, for the best connectivity, not just for the best effort. Yes. So guarantee QS on the Wi-Fi, not just best effort. And you can do a lot when you are in the access point side of the things.
Yes, you can for listeners, QoS is quality of service. Some of the listeners might not be familiar with that. What does it mean, actually? Tell us a bit about quality of service in the context of wireless connectivity.
I mean, there's a few different metrics that you measure. Obviously, at the application level is very different, but at the lowest level, we look at latency, performance, packet error rates, and things like that to give something which is equivalent to a wireline communication. And our goal was to get as close as to the wireline, so you never can tell the difference between an Ethernet port or a Wi-Fi connectivity.
Yeah, and this is something I really like, because I can describe Quantenna very simply, very powerfully, and very succinctly, because I can say, a chipset, of course, this is what you were building, a Wi-Fi wireless chipset. But the goal of that was to provide connectivity that was essentially undistinguishable from a wired connection through an Ethernet cable, which some of our listeners might not even remember at this point, because we only use Wi-Fi today. We rarely see an Ethernet cable these days. But also, interestingly enough, you told me before we recorded this podcast that you decided early on to focus on performance So having the fastest, the most reliable, the ones with the best quality of service, connectivity at the expense or ignoring the energy side, the energy aspects of your chipset, which would have been, of course, very important for mobile phones, for smartphones at least. But you also told me something interesting there, which makes sense. In the Wi-Fi protocol, if my Wi-Fi router at home is doing very well, it provides great performance, the amount of energy my cell phone needs to spend to connect through the Wi-Fi to the internet is actually lower, because the protocol, the Wi-Fi protocol, optimizes the energy consumption and the power, the signal strength of those two antennas to just make sure that there's no packet loss, but also to minimize the energy consumption and how much I use of the spectrum, right? So ironically, almost, you optimize for performance on routers, but you end up helping mobile phones too with your product.
Absolutely. So yeah, the whole better network is going to make every device in the network better, and it was something which was totally ignored because the volumes weren't as high. But if you look at it today, there are about 800 million broadband subscribers worldwide, and is a huge number of the residential gateways, Wi-Fi access points that you sell. And that's not the only thing. You sell repeaters, you will sell other devices which are powered up. They need better Wi-Fi. So it worked out okay.
Yeah, nice. So let me ask you another question there. So on the fundraising side, I would love to do that podcast that you are offering to, but maybe not today. But it would be interesting because fundraising. Yeah. No, I know. But fundraising is extremely painful, but also it's one of the most important thing in a company. I did it myself. It was terrible. I don't want to do it ever again if possible. But of course, you need it to make a company grow, at least when it's the type of company that it's poised for hyper growth. But forgetting fundraising for a moment, let's focus a bit more on something. So you were essentially selling your product not to end users, but to telcos or to hardware manufacturers, companies that will build routers, companies that would integrate your chipsets into more complex systems. How was your go-to-market strategy, and how did you manage to go from $1 million in revenue, ballpark, to $120 million in 6 years? What was the go-to-market that allowed you to do that?
Right. So first of all, I think we picked a market which was service provider. Just coming to that conclusion was not as easy as said. I mean, it took a lot of pain and conversations in order to get to that point. That should we do that versus consumers and enterprise and few other opportunities which was out there. We took that for multiple reasons. One was that we were well aware of the service provider market, so we knew there was a need. As a matter of fact, my previous job, I had done a great. I had a good sense of connections in that market, and I understood the need well. So did the rest of the executive team. The second thing that we knew that they wanted to take the best product, because product was actually secondary to them, to the service. They were selling a service, and the goodness of the product determined how well the service was going on. And the service was a monthly fee, and the product was a one-time expense for them. So they would not be thrifty on making those choices, and they would not be just rushing those decisions, which is painful because it takes a long time for them to make a decision. But at least you will trust they will make the decision on the right merits. Yeah. Because they want the things to go wrong.
So sorry if I interrupt you. Let me make sure that we clarify this for the audience. So a service provider could be a telecom, for example. Is that correct?
And provider, a broadband provider.
Yeah, broadband provider, which most commonly is a telecom, but it could be other companies too. These companies were selling internet access to their customers, and they were using routers and similar devices that had your chipset installed in it. That chipset was the one providing a better performing Wi-Fi experience for them. And what you're saying is, you pay, let's say, $100 for the service and a monthly fee. If the service is not good enough, so if you don't get internet access or if it's spotty, the customer might ask for refunds or damages in a way. which essentially kills any profit that that company could make. So for them, it would be particularly important to carefully pick the right technical solution. That's why the decision-making cycle is particularly long compared to other type of products, because there is a very important critical aspect of their business. Like if you are not a good product, they cannot make money, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they sell, I mean, they sell internet today, and they also sell, for example, video, which is also you notice the imperfections a lot easier than even internet, because you get pixelization and other things when things are not going well. And the consumer demands the best, because it is not their problem how the data is distributed around the home. And even if it is not their fault, a customer calling the call center costs them money. Just that person picking up the phone and answering the call, it is the money is spent. So they try to make sure that infrastructure is as good as possible, and they do a lot of investment in that infrastructure, because once they deploy a unit, it's not just Wi-Fi in it. There is like a cable modem or DSL or fiber in it as well. It's a whole box. So for one single chipset in there, they don't want the whole thing to be recalled. And then there's a cost of deployment associated with it, because shipping this thing, or even if it's self-installed, it has to get shipped, or many times the technician goes to the home to set up everything. So that's even bigger money than the equipment itself. And if they have to send the truck roll to people's home, at the lowest number I ever heard, and I was so surprised about how low that was, it was about $100 a service call. But this number starts from there and goes up.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of money involved, and they want to make sure that there is no issue with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly enough, today this value proposition is a bit, let's say, it's changing, because Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, Apple TV, all those services, they are fundamentally different from cable TV or other types of more traditional TV services, right?
Right. So absolutely. So there is two different things here. One is that the video services that the service providers were providing is getting less and less of that, because of the cord cutters who are going to like Netflix, this type of the worlds. But the other thing is, what doesn't change is that the broadband consumption in the home actually is going up with all those things as well. So, there's multiple screens, and there's a lot of content available that everyone is watching their favorite video on a different screen and so forth. So when you go to the core of the infrastructure, that even has to become stronger as a function of time. Yeah. So even though video is maybe leaving the service provider, but broadband is getting stronger with the service provider.
Yeah, that's correct. So in essence, how would you describe your, roughly 9 years as CEO of this company? Because then the company was acquired, someone else took over, you remained involved with the company, but essentially you run this company for about 9 years, more or less. How would you describe this experience? What was the highlight of this experience, and did you have fun doing it?
Right, absolutely. And I think that you did mention earlier about me being the engineer. So I tell you what I enjoy the most. I enjoy building things. I enjoy creating. And as an engineer, obviously, I enjoy creating better products. And I was in the, as lucky as someone can get, because at one point I'm looking at the products and I do get involved with it as much as I can. And my bandwidth allowed it to be even in the design reviews and understanding the product spec and getting even giving ideas about the technology itself, which was rewarding for me, which was great. But so I can look at those products and technology wise and appreciate that. At the same time, I also enjoy the fact that I was involved with creating something new, which was called the company itself. Because company is a living being and a creation on its own. Yeah. And the products come, products go. But the organization, infrastructure, the culture that you build is going to remain and carry over even after you. And if you look at all these big companies, you can almost associate. You look at different companies in your mind, you will associate the different personalities with the company, which is just a paperwork, right? Because it's a culture that the founders and the initial people, created in those companies. So I really enjoyed the both fact of being involved with the cutting edge technology, but also creating a organization which had his own personality. Yeah. And I so it was best 10 years of my life, even though it made me age like 30 years. So
You still look young. Don't worry about it. You're, Middle Eastern or Asian descent, like me, Europeans. We tend to age quite well. I would say that helps us.
yeah, I'm only 25. So
Of course. So let's change subject a bit now. So I got to know you because of Cota Capital. We're both operating partners. You knew some people, some partners at Cota Capital, since a long time, but you joined as an operating partner relatively recently, about 8 or 9 months ago.
that's
And
correct.
I've been involved for a bit longer, for a bit more than a year. So Cota Capital is a VC firm, an investment firm based in San Francisco, two founding partners and a few other partners that joined along the way. We met through Cota Capital. So how would you describe your involvement with Cota Capital? What do you do usually with Cota Capital? What are the areas of interest for you?
Right. So my history and where I think I can contribute, the area of comfort for me, and then there is edges that I can put, the areas of challenges around that, is connectivity. So I've been doing connectivity all my career. Wireless, wireline, name it, DSL, satellite, cellular, Wi-Fi, and so forth, to name a few.
Smoke
So
signals.
smoke signals, yeah, smoke signals is when I was a kid, I was doing that. So so that's the area that I think that I like to be involved with Cota, to help them out when it comes down to projects or thoughts in that domain.
Nice. And by the way, you mentioned connectivity. I should mention that on September 17th, Cota is organizing Cota Access, which is a series of events. And this one in particular is about 5G and edge computing. And on the footnotes of the show, of the podcast, you will find the details of how to sign up to attend. It's a virtual event, so you can attend from anywhere in the world. September 17th, 10 a.m. Pacific time, or 1 p.m. Eastern time in the US. And of course, you can do the math if you are in other parts of the world. So let's touch a bit about connectivity. Maybe in particular, we talk about 5G. For context, some of the listeners, I'm sure that everyone has heard of 5G, up to this point. But very few people know about 5G. They know what the difference is between 5G and the previous 4G. For example, 5G can be offered in 3 bands, a low band, a medium band, a high band, and each one has different characteristics. Low band and medium band, they provide connectivity over longer distances, while the high band can't really travel across walls, for example, but provides much bigger throughput, much more bandwidth, if you will. But tell us a bit about what is interesting about 5G, why it is important, why is it going to be a technology that will shape the world in a different way, and of course, what are the pros and cons? Because I'm sure that it's not all beautiful for 5G. There might be aspects that do not convince you, maybe costs or maybe other issues. So tell us a bit about 5G.
Yes, so 5G has many different applications. Some of those applications, you can imagine them to come immediately. Some of those applications will take a little bit longer time to come. So one of the applications is fixed wireless in access. So you use 5G frequencies, and you could use 5G or other technologies over 5G frequencies, which is a license band to provide broadband into the homes. And that is going to be replacing fiber, DSL, or DOCSIS cable modems.
Or offering it in places where there's no coverage, right?
Yeah. So, or it is a coverage by another provider.
Yes.
Let's say I am a service provider, and my competitors owns the fiber to that home, and I don't want to pull my fiber, or I don't want to deal with him. I can provide broadband access to those homes. If you look at it, there are, like, let's say T-Mobile in all the 50 states in US, but they have zero broadband capability. They are in the 50 states with a cellular.
Yeah.
The question is, can they use their access to 5G frequencies and their existing infrastructure to also become a broadband provider.
Yeah.
Or you think about AT&T, if I remember correctly, they're about in 12 states providing broadband, but they're in 50 states providing cellular.
Yeah.
So can they, for both defensive and offensive purposes, provide broadband as well on top of their cellular?
Yeah, and here we're talking about US states for
US
context, but of course this would apply anywhere in the world. Anywhere where you have a cellular network, you could use 5G frequencies to offer the equivalent of an invisible cable that provides you with broadband access to the internet without the cost of laying down or excavating, cables, fibers, and stuff like this.
Yeah. So that's something that I know that quite few people are involved with and looking at it. Various operators and companies that looking at that, and they're solving this issue in different ways. What is common in a lot of them is that they're using the license bands for this purpose in order to guarantee the service, because they know that there is less of an interference or no interference because it's a control band, the license band, when they do that, versus unlicensed band like 5 gigahertz or 2.4 gigahertz of Wi-Fi that anyone could turn on the Wi-Fi system on the same band when you wanted to watch that Netflix TV and might cause an issue to you.
Yeah.
So
I have two questions here. The question number one is, how would you compare, let's say, broadband access to the internet provided with 5G in the way you described just now to the internet access that I could get, for example, from Starlink, the satellite network that SpaceX is launching in space? What are the main differences? Of course, latency is offered at different levels. How would you compare these two?
Yeah, so satellite, I think, is something which is meant really for when you cannot get anything else. Is like a last resort, and it really meant for the corners of the world that that availability is not there, because it's very hard to compete with a local type of a thing, which is in the case of the 5G with the directional antennas, you kind of beamform toward the same house and you're not using that bandwidth too much for everyone else. In the case of the fiber, is dedicated line to you almost. I mean, it does get shared to some level, but it's still it's pretty known thing. Versus something which gets beamed from the sky and to compete at the same level of the performance. And other than that is the latency, of course, because as you go through the sky, even with the LEO satellite, low orbit satellites, you still have some level of latency. And if you don't have latency, then you have Doppler, because these things are moving very fast around the Earth. Yeah. So, which you have to overcome, and you have to do handoff from one satellite to another because they come and go. And the geo satellites, which are really far away in the space, and they're just always above you, definitely takes a long time to go up and come back down again.
Yeah, it's about, I think, half a second round trip, everything included, which is quite high for anything that requires interactivity.
That's right.
Like this video call we're doing now would probably not work well over a satellite network.
We will all have to pause after everything in order for the other person to know that we are done so they can speak. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
But there are applications which you don't care. And the question is how desperate you are to get on the internet. I mean, if you're doing web browsing or watching a video, what do you care if there's a latency there? Watching a video, you do care about the throughput, but you don't care about the latency. And if you're just web browsing, you don't care for either one of them as much.
Of course.
So it's really application dependent. But if you're doing telemedicine and you want to do surgery from somewhere else, or if you're doing a factory automation, the latency is going to kill you. I mean, obviously, even a video call, it could be very annoying.
Yeah, that's true. What about edge computing? And in relation to 5G, but even in general, what's your take on why edge computing is becoming interesting? What is the application that you think is the most promising from your point of view? And what is instead the thing that is maybe too hyped? The thing that people believe, is true, where is probably not going to happen anytime soon.
Right. So I think that, if you look at the computing, and I'm looking at some AI companies, I mean, obviously there is room for a lot of different variations, such as it's just similar to what it was for Wi-Fi. I mean, you cannot say that, hey, I need a Wi-Fi in my mobile phone. Why do I need a Wi-Fi in the access point? You need Wi-Fi in all of this, and you need computing in all of this. And the question is, why do you want to do something at the edge versus in the data center all the way up in the cloud? And then I think there's something in between, which I call cloud edge or the fog, which is the edge at the last place of it. Actually, 5G pays a close attention to this cloud edge because of the reduction of latency. So I will do things at the cloud edge because of latency. I will do things at the edge because of further latency reduction, or maybe distributed computing, that I want to have a total control or privacy of what I'm doing and don't want that data to leave me.
Yeah,
So
that's a good point. In fact, I was actually discussing this with someone else the other day, and we were considering that most video calls actually happen in a relatively short range.
right.
We usually, even now in this time of COVID and social distancing, you and I are essentially 25 miles away, maybe ballpark. So if we need to go through a data center that is in Southern California for any reason, we are adding a few milliseconds of latency that is unnecessary. So
Right.
that could be applications, specific
Oh, yeah.
applications where proximity can actually take advantage of a lower latency, especially when I can compute at the edge, versus using the big data center, which will still be there, that will still be
Right.
used by other applications. But I think this opens up another type of opportunities for specific type of applications, like you were saying earlier.
Right. Yeah, there are certain applications that you must just do in the cloud. I mean, you don't have any choice, being the computation power that you require, or the access to upgrades of the software, or the training of the AI software, or else that you want to do in the cloud. Now, the issue is the latency, and the closer you get that cloud to the end customer, obviously you address that as well.
Yeah, correct. Let me ask you maybe a couple of other final questions before we wrap up. So one question is about, what do you see as the most exciting things that you think will happen around connectivity? And this is not just specific about 5G. What's new, what's hot, what's interesting, what's emerging, what's bleeding edge in your view? Anything interesting that you've seen that makes you excited?
Right. I mean, I think that there is two different things. One is that two things that there's a lot of things happens in the connectivity that we are as the end consumers, we are not aware of it. I mean, the joke that we had earlier was that the end customer thinks they connect through just Wi-Fi, and then some magic way the Wi-Fi takes their data to somewhere else in the world. They don't recognize all the infrastructure which goes behind that, and there's a lot of activities there.
Yeah.
But closest to my heart, because of my experience being a wireless guy in the last 10 years, is 5G and Wi-Fi. And I think that if it comes down even to Wi-Fi, it is even less appreciated than 5G to some level, while it is actually, it is multifold of deployments of Wi-Fi worldwide than there is 5G. And, then mobile, not 5G.
Yeah, then mobile, yes.
Mobile in general, not just 5G. And that's because it's an ad hoc network that it gets set up easy and gets going, and you don't need a lot of technicians to come do that installation for you. And it's just amazing that you can go buy equipment in Taiwan, bring it and bring equipment from Italy and manufacture there, and bring it to US, and they work totally fine through the Wi-Fi protocol, and there is no issue which service provider it came from and what is the band is using and all of the above. With the things which is happening in Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 7, being 11AX and behind, I think that there is a new set of applications which is going to get enabled, such as more IoT and more lower power applications. Today, Wi-Fi is not really designed for very low power. Yeah. I mean, you can do it on the phone, but you charge your phone every day. But what if I told you that your device has to be living on a battery for 5 years? Yeah. Is a sensor out there that has to live on a battery. It's not Wi-Fi is not meant for that. There is other technologies who do that. There is you go a little bit lower power. There is Bluetooth, there is Zigbee, there is Z-Wave. There's a lot of other technology, LoRa. There's a lot of different technologies who do that. But Wi-Fi is meant to go down. And once Wi-Fi is able to get to that level of power consumptions, that's where you see the convergence of IoT. That's where you really see the IoT happen, because you can go grab a device from your local store, bring it to your home network, and not worry about connectivity, and do all these IoT things that you ever meant to do with the low power, this and that, and sensors around and so forth.
Yeah.
And Wi-Fi in its looks and feels, with a with the new physical layer technologies that are introducing, is also starting to look more like 5G. In the other side, the 5G is looking at unlicensed band, which is the Wi-Fi band, and they're more looking like, to some level, they're enabling another path of being more like Wi-Fi. So there is going to be, in my point of view, or my humble opinion, there is going to be a point in time that these things would converge, but none of them would disappear.
Yeah.
In some time, they get closer to each other, that they eventually converge. But you're going to need the both type of a licensed and unlicensed band type of a technologies to coexist and go forward.
Okay. Last question for you. If you were starting a new company in the connectivity space, what would be the best? Actually, someone else is starting a company in that space. What would be the best advice you can give them
in connectivity?
Yes. So,
well, if
a founder comes to you, and says, "I have this great idea. Let me tell you about it," and you decide you like this person, and you want to give him an advice based on your experience, what would be that advice?
Right. So you're talking about the type of the technologies in connectivity they want to go, or in general principle advice?
General principle advice. As a founder, what is the best piece of advice you can give them if they want to do a company in this particular space?
Right. So, I mean, my general advice is, I think, independent of the space. I think that there are two different things which makes you successful. First, you have to have a problem. Then you have to have a solution for the problem. Right. So many of us, we are engineers, and we come up with solutions, and we're going to look for the problems. So my thing is that, what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and how big that problem is? Does the world really needs this solution today? And if I was going to look at things, I mean, my own experience here was with Wi-Fi, which was an existing market. In some level, it was easier because I didn't have to explain to them what Wi-Fi was, in a sense that I told them that this is just better and it's going to solve these applications. But at the core technology didn't have to be explained. My favorite example is when people talk about Uber and Airbnb. You think about them as two successful companies, but they have gone after a market which existed. Hospitality is not a new market. You can size that market right away. It says, well, there is this many $1 billion per year spent on that money and that market. And transportation is not a new market. But you come up with a solution which is order of magnitude better than the existing solution, and you go after the market which you know it exists, and you capture it all. So I would just focus on where is the market, how big is that market, and how well your solution is going to revolutionize and change that market.
Nice. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time today. And I hope you enjoyed this chat as much as I did. And looking forward to see you, hopefully, in the not too distant future, in person again. When
Thank you for having me on this podcast, and I appreciate talking to you, and hope this COVID thing goes away soon, and we see each other in the office again.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.